Hey Mojoholics, I'm your host Rebecca, and in this 8th episode of WatchMojo FAQ, we've got a special treat for you guys. Our video game dude Dave is here to talk about the video games of all time series and to say why certain things were not on the lists. Hey Mojoholics, welcome to WatchMojo FAQ episode 8. As mentioned last week, Ash is traveling this week, so with me is our resident video game expert Dave to talk about some of our video game content.
Hi there.
That being said, I know video games about as well as I know Indiana Jones, so to replace me is my partner in crime and brother from another mother, Dan.
Oh, hi Dan.
Hey Dave. Okay, so probably the most frequently asked question was, why isn't my favorite game here on the list?
Now, this is pretty much a universal question on all of our lists. Yes. The biggest question, of course, is, like, why wasn't my favorite game on here? And the most obvious answer for that is that we can only fit 10 games on the list, 15 if you include honorable mentions. And when you're talking about thousands of really good video games, and just because they didn't make the list doesn't mean they're not good, they are still great. We have to look for the absolute best of the best, and this brings us back to how our top 10 video games per generation series works. Dan, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, well, basically, what we did was we did a whole series before we got to the top 10 video games of all time. We did top 10 video games of the 3rd generation, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and then finally we did the all-time list, which was essentially a redux taking bits of all of those generational lists together and making a big one. Now, we implore you to check out those lists. They're really good. Most of our favorites had to end up on those lists as well. If you're looking for your favorites, a lot of the things that people put in the comments ended up on those lists. They're really good.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the criteria we had for the all-time list was that the game needs to have made at least rank 4 or higher in the generations list. So games that didn't quite make the list but were still amazing games. Games like The Last of Us, Shadow of the Colossus, and one of Dan's favorite games, StarCraft.
StarCraft didn't make it. Final Fantasy VII, Batman Arkham City. The list is enormous.
Yeah, so we could go on of thousands of other games, but we could only cover 50 games. And the 50 games we chose were really good, but obviously we can't fit everyone's preference in there.
Yeah, this will bring us to our next point, but when you're making a list that's an all-time list, it's more important that you don't forget the really big ones, because that would look like a bit much bigger, a more glaring omission than it would be to include something that's more niche, something that's more new, something that's got maybe more modern recognition, but that it doesn't really have the whole timeless appeal. For instance, we got a lot of comments, how did Tetris make the list? We picked Tetris as number 2. Now, we realize a lot of people were probably a little bit disappointed with this, like you're waiting for your game to come up and then like the second spot is taken up by something that's quote unquote boring or old. Now, we understand that, but at the same time, forgetting Tetris would make us look like total boners. We really can't do that. Like, Dave, if you want to riff on that.
Yeah, because Tetris is pretty much what you would consider a timeless classic, pretty much like chess. When it was first released in Russia, it was insanely popular. When it was released on the Game Boy 5 years later, it pretty much sold the Game Boy. It's been sold on pretty much every other console known to man today. With smartphones, it's one of the highest selling games on the App Store. It's pretty much the definition of a timeless classic. It's 30 years old, it still continues to sell, and it will probably continue to sell 30 years later.
Yeah, so we stand by that point. We realize it was a little boring, or a little passé for some people, but it's still like we said, if we were to forget it, it would seem like a much bigger mistake on our part, so we got to do it. This, unfortunately, brings us to our last point, which was we picked Ocarina of Time, that's The Legend of Zelda, as number 1. Some people were pretty annoyed about that.
Yeah, obviously, the number 1 choice is obviously going to cause a lot of contention. I think the biggest issue was that if you go to a whole lot of other lists, a lot of people will always see at the number 1 slot, Ocarina of Time. So I understand that a lot of people would obviously be upset that it's always at number 1, but we actually did try to look for a successor, and we tried to look for something that had the story, the gameplay, the combat mechanics, how much it revolutionized the genre and gaming as a whole, and we unfortunately fell short of finding a good successor. The best one we found to being close to that was Half-Life 2.
but we eventually decided not to pick Half-Life 2 because it has no ending. Like Dave already said, we tried long and hard thinking, if not Ocarina of Time, then what else? And we went over it again and again and again, and it just seemed like not necessarily the safest bet, but the most secure bet for number one. You might not be a fan. I'm not actually necessarily a giant fan of Ocarina of Time. I know it's not your favorite Zelda game.
Yeah, my personal favorite is Link's Awakening. Yours is?
Link to the Past, actually. So it's not that we're super biased for Ocarina of Time. It's just that's the general consensus in both the gaming community and the critical community, and we can't really argue with that.
I just wanted to make one final point, like putting together a top 10 list that everyone's going to be happy with of all time
is impossible.
It's impossible. It's not as easy as it looks.
Anyway, guys, so thank you very much. We're going to hand it back to Rebecca. She'll also be back next week with Ash, our CEO. So here you go.
Thanks for watching WatchMojo FAQ. Tune in again next time and tell us what you think.